Subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions without objection, so ordered. For members participating remotely, please let committee staff know as soon as possible if you are experiencing connectivity issues or technical problems. To avoid any inadvertent background noise, I request that every member please keep their microphone muted when not seeking recognition to speak. Should I hear any inadvertent background noise, I will request that the member please mute their microphone. And finally, to insert a document into the record, please have your staff email it to documentstni@mail.house.gov. With that, I will proceed with my remarks. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation Subcommittee hearing on impacts of shipping container shortages, delays, and increased demand on the North American supply chain. Today, we will hear from witnesses who can speak to the unprecedented conditions in the container shipping market. That is an important issue and requires our attention not only to determine the root causes of the problem, but also to hear potential solutions to alleviate the strain on our supply chain and prevent future disruptions in the future. In every sector of international commerce, the COVID-19 pandemic is having long-lasting consequences and is drastically disrupting global and domestic supply chains. The shift to work from home for many Americans resulted in a significant increase in online shopping. A heightened demand for imported consumer goods, manufacturing parts, and commodities produced in Asia, coupled with periodic labor shortages due to COVID outbreaks, has fueled massive backlogs and price increases in the shipping container market. The increased flow of goods has primarily been from China to the United States and has resulted in significant port congestion, especially on the U.S. West Coast. South of my district, at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, there are many as 60 ships anchored off the coast, which doesn't include even more ships that were unable to anchor offshore due to a lack of overflow space. This is a major problem. In addition, carriers have often chosen to ship empty containers back to Asia rather than carry U.S. exports, since it is more profitable to do so. As of June 3rd, container rates from Los Angeles to Shanghai were only $779 compared to $5,952 from Shanghai to Los Angeles, highlighting just how massively imbalanced the market is. Container shortages have placed a heavy strain on our agriculture exports, leaving them without access to international markets and no guarantee that their product will be delivered on time. These shortages also cause backups in port terminals where containers are stacking higher than ever, making it more difficult for truckers to move containers across the country. Longshore workers are burning both ends of the candle, trying to keep pace with the deluge of imports. And all while American workers have been exposed to numerous COVID-19 outbreaks in ports, making their health and welfare all the more uncertain. Delays are also costly, not only in time lost, but also in the application of detention and demurrage fees for lengthy container storage times, both on ships and on docks. For example, container turnaround times have nearly doubled from 60 to 100 days. Add to that peak season surcharges, and it becomes very difficult for our exporters to compete in the global marketplace. On March 10th, I sent a bipartisan letter to the Federal Maritime Commission, along with Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Graves, and Ranking Member Gibbs, to ensure that ocean carriers are abiding by the Shipping Act of 1984 and not engaging in unjust and unreasonable shipping practices. I look forward to hearing from the FMC, who is currently conducting Fact-Finding 29, an investigation to identify operational solutions to cargo delivery system challenges related to COVID-19. Today, I look forward to hearing from the diverse interests, including international carriers, domestic exporters, labor, and ports, as well as from the FMC on how they are addressing this issue. I now call on Ranking Member Graves for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Carbajal, and also I want to add my thanks to our witnesses here today. I am very interested to hear what our witnesses have to say about the impact of the current cargo surge and on the availability of containers for agriculture products, agriculture exports, imports, and the capacity to move agriculture products, obviously, to U.S. ports. I represent a very heavily agriculture district, and exports represent life and death for my district's economy. I understand that the Federal Maritime Commission doesn't approve ocean carrier routes or require the availability of equipment on those routes, but I am very interested to hear about Federal Maritime Commissioner Dye's fact-finding number 29, as the chairman pointed out, when those results obviously become available. I'm also looking forward to hearing from Chairman Maffei about whether the Federal Maritime Commission has authority it needs to take effective enforcement actions when unfair and unreasonable practices are identified. Looking forward to this hearing. Thanks for having it. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you. I will now recognize Chairman DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support what the ranking member just said in terms of potentially moving toward solutions to this issue. I know a lot of us, Sam has, and I have, and many members have heard from constituents who are concerned about the supply chain disruptions. In fact, today, one of my constituents, Alexis Jacobson, she's the International Accounts Manager for Bosco Trading LLC, located in Tangent, Oregon, testifying on issues and sharing her experience as an agricultural exporter operating on the West Coast. So I don't think this hearing could have come at a more appropriate time. I'm not going to belabor some of the points that were made earlier about how critical the maritime supply chain is, but I mean, 195% increase in the cost of transporting a shipping container in 1 year, somewhat caused by consumer demand here in the United States. But the problem is this is an asymmetric demand for imports. It means that shippers are focusing on carrying high-value goods from overseas and not so much on our critical but lower-cost exports, particularly in the agricultural sector. I mean, this has included citrus, almonds, walnuts, tomatoes, timber, seed, hay, straw, just to name a few. Some of these things require refrigeration, and delays can cause tremendous losses. In Oregon, last year, the recycling industry exported 280,000 metric tons of product worth $176 million. And in the U.S., more than 30% of our recycled material is exported. Container shortages and rate increases have resulted in a year-over-year decline in those exports in February of this year, the most recent statistics we have. And the ports have become more productive. They've doubled their productivity. But the lines of ships go over the horizon, backed up, waiting to get in. We had, obviously COVID disruptions and other things, and that we had some labor shortages because of that, and we're recovering from those things. But these delays are increasing costs for smaller exporters and exporters of, again, these products that are not the highest value. Last year, this subcommittee held a hearing on the maritime supply chain, how to rebuild it following COVID-19. We did many rescue packages, but we never helped the ports in any significant way. We passed the Maritime Transportation Safety Emergency Relief Authority but it failed to get funded, which could have helped mitigate or prevent some of these problems this year. So, you know, I've heard from ports, I've heard from shippers, shipping companies, and labor on potential solutions. And I'm hopeful that today's hearing will lead us in a direction where we can take corrective action. And hopefully this year, you know, if it requires federal appropriations, get the money spent and solve this problem. It's absolutely critical to our economy. Thank you for holding this hearing, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman DeFazio. I now recognize Ranking Member Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, before I start, I want to ask unanimous consent that the following items be inserted in the record: a chart from the Health Industry Distributors Association, a statement from the American Association of Railroads, a statement from the North American Meat Institute, a letter from the National Association of Chemical Distributors, and a dozen items from the Agricultural Transportation Coalition. I understand that these all have been provided electronically to the Subcommittee Legislative Assistant.
Without objection, submitted.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Carbajal, and our witnesses for being here today. Since the beginning of this traditional peak shipping season, starting in late August, the United States ports have been experiencing a record surge in cargo imports. This surge is expected to continue at least through 2021, and some say in the second quarter of 2022, as we recover from COVID and also consumer behavior changes. More than 30 container vessels routinely wait for space at the ports of LA and Long Beach, and the Port of LA had its biggest month on record in May. The surge is attributed to pent-up demand from the reduced cargo flow earlier in 2020 and changes in consumer spending patterns, given increased staying at home time in 2020 and 2021. Increases in pandemic-related items like personal protective equipment, the decreased port throughout because of COVID's impact on port operations, including increased testing, COVID infections in workers, and quarantining. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses if they agree with these popular explanations of the cargo surge. The real-world pressure test for the U.S. port capacity has led to container shortages for certain U.S. exports, particularly ag exports. Pressure on intermodal rail connections, delays in receipts of merchandise from certain importers, shortages of chassis for drayage, and accusations of abuses regarding detention demurrage charges, which I'll note ocean carriers and terminal operators deny. Prior to the container surge, the Federal Maritime Commission was already conducting fact-finding number 29 regarding detention demurrage. I understand that the fact-finding is now also looking at container shortages in some export markets. I look forward to Commissioner Dye's update on the status of fact-finding number 29. I understand the Commissioner is the former staff director of the subcommittee. I am also interested in learning more about her work on supply chain data transparency. In addition, the Commission has issued interpretive guidance on detention and demurrage to ocean carriers and marine terminal operators, but the Hill continues to hear complaints. Though I understand few complaints have been filed with the Commission, I joined the chairman and ranking member of the full committee and subcommittee, Chairman Carbajal, in writing the FMC to urge vigorous enforcement of the Subtitle 4 of Title 46, popularly known as the Shipping Act, if any violations are found. I hope recommendations for industry practices to deal with future cargo surges will emerge from today's hearings. The health of U.S. agricultural exports are life and death economic issues in rural districts across America. Therefore, I'd like to strengthen the system to assure sufficient capacity in the supply chain to protect U.S. ag exports in the future. Thank you, Chairman Carbajal, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Gibbs. I would now like to welcome the witnesses on our first panel. First, we have the Honorable Daniel B. Maffei, Chairman, Federal Maritime Commission. And second, we have the Honorable Rebecca Dye, Commissioner, Federal Maritime Commission. Thank you both for being here today. I would like to look forward to your testimony. Without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. Since your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee requests that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. With that, we will commence with Chairman Maffei. You may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Carbajal. Ranking Member Graves and Full Committee Ranking Member Gibbs and members of the subcommittee. I'm also very glad to see Full Committee Chairman Pete DeFazio. He was very kind to me when I was a member of Congress. I won't necessarily assume he'll be as kind to me in this new role. I appreciate your invitation today, and I particularly appreciate how this subcommittee has paid attention to our ocean freight system. Some of the things I may say will sound repetitive, but that's only because you were so well informed in your opening statements. Now, most of the time, of course, the public pays little notice to how ocean freight moves consumer goods, commodities, and manufacturers' inputs to and from our country. But now concern is growing as the COVID pandemic and the ensuing record import surge threatens the reliability of the system and drives up costs. When President Biden designated me chair of the FMC on March 29th, the ocean freight system was already at or beyond capacity, with volumes up dramatically at virtually every port in America and rates already at record levels. The cost of a container has gone up 4 times what it cost last year and sometimes more. Just finding a space on a carrier is very difficult. And even if a shipper's box does make it on the ship, there will likely be substantial delays in transit time. Of particular concern to me is the increase in price and the shortage of available containers affecting exporters. While carriers are actually moving more exports overall than in previous years, the increase in exports does not match the boom in imports. Moreover, the amount a carrier makes moving an import container is so much compared to what they make on an export box that in some cases a ship will carry fewer containers full of exports than its capacity in order to more rapidly move empty containers back to foreign ports to fill them with new US-bound imports. So what is the FMC doing about all of this? Last year, the FMC unanimously approved the rule on detention and demurrage to make clear when assessment of these charges on a shipper is unreasonable and violates the Shipping Act. Last fall, the FMC increased the reporting requirements for the 3 major alliances of steamship lines to ensure that these carriers are not violating their agreements or the law. Last fall, we also launched a formal investigation of issues examining detention and demurrage, container return requirements, and lack of containers available for export. This investigation is called Fact Finding 29 and is led by our most experienced commissioner, Rebecca Dye, who with my full support is here to report directly to you. Also, where appropriate, I and others have reached out directly to the carriers to persuade them that it is in their long-term best interest to accept as many exports as possible. Finally, the FMC voted last month to implement our new National Shipper Advisory Committee so we can hear directly from shippers on an ongoing basis. That committee is half exporters. There's always more to do, but it is vital to understand the true nature of this crisis to assess what the FMC can and can't do. First, the difficulties are global. Congestion, reliability, and cost issues are hitting ports, businesses, and ocean link transportation networks, not just in America, but worldwide. Second, the crisis does not just affect shipping, but the entire supply chain. Attention has been focused on the ports because this is where we see the dramatic pictures of ships lining up in piles of containers. But outdated infrastructure, equipment and labor shortages, rail issues, and limited warehouse all diminish our capacity. And third, the primary reason for the congestion, high prices, and lack of reliability is that demand for cargo shipping has outstripped the supply. For years, the increasing supply of cargo space on bigger and bigger ships kept ocean freight rates on the low side. But now COVID and its effects have created record demand for shipping and record freight rates as well. The demand for imports will likely not diminish until 2022, as the ranking member pointed out. But the supply of space on ships is not increased enough to keep track with that. Beyond these 3 factors, the global nature of trade, challenges throughout the supply chain, and the vast increase in demand, the federal government is limited in ways that it can help. Of course, we can do we can do investments into infrastructure, both physical infrastructure and informational infrastructure. We can put in more measures to get more information to shippers than they currently get, which would definitely improve efficiency. But these are not immediate solutions. So in the meantime, the FMC will continue to help exporters and other U.S. shippers navigate the system and file complaints. We will communicate with various stakeholders in the supply chain and help them work together to make the system more efficient and reliable. We'll keep in touch with federal agencies and you in Congress, and we'll stay open-minded to finding new ways of making the situation better. And we will work hard to make sure nobody makes a profit from this current crisis in a way that violates the Shipping Act. And I know that Commissioner Dye will say a lot more on these efforts, so I thank you and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Chairman Maffei. And now we'll move to Commissioner Dye. You may proceed. Commissioner Dye, you may proceed.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Gibbs, Chairman DeFazio, and Ranking Member Graves. Of course, members of the subcommittee. I'm pleased to be with you today to discuss my fact-finding 29 investigation, dealing with the effects of COVID-19 on the United States International Ocean Freight Delivery System. Thank you for your support of the Commission's National Shipper Advisory Committee, enacted as part of the Elijah Cummings Coast Guard Authorization Act. We're currently soliciting for 12 exporters and 12 exporters for the committee. I've included a summary describing my investigation to date as part of my testimony today. The fact-finding 29 investigation is my fourth major commission investigation, and I very much appreciate the strong support I've received from Chairman Maffei. My focus in fact-finding 29 is how to strengthen the performance of the overall United States International Freight Delivery System. This requires closer coordination and visibility among exporters, importers, truckers, ocean carriers, marine terminals and ports, longshore labor, railroads, chassis providers, and shipping intermediaries. There are three major obstacles to resolving this port congestion hardships. The problems we're experiencing are not new. They occur in every cargo surge or peak season. No supply chain actor alone, not ocean carriers or ports, can develop a solution without a coordinated approach with other supply chain actors. The lack of mutual commitment between parties to freight delivery systems keeps parties from achieving enforceable agreements. The Commission order on fact-finding 29 authorizes me to form FMC supply chain innovation teams to develop commercial solutions to port congestion and related supply chain challenges. Fact-finding 29 used 9 small teams to identify several major supply chain bottlenecks for future work. These small teams were composed of industry leaders with the knowledge and experience, and most important, the willingness to work to change the system. I hope to convene these teams in person in the near future. I'd like to emphasize one final thing about the current state of fact-finding 29 and the supplemental order the Commission issued to me last November. Our Bureau of Enforcement staff are currently investigating cases of potential unreasonable and detention charges involving the most common situation affecting exporters, confusion concerning the earliest return date. More investigations will follow, perhaps involving other potentially unreasonable practices. No further regulatory or statutory action is necessary for us to enforce the Commission's demurrage and detention rule. We do require, like any other law enforcement agency, facts to investigate a potential violation. Our Bureau of Enforcement needs just evidence, a brief description of facts surrounding a potential violation, and a bill of lading number to begin an investigation. Finally, Mr. Chairman, our U.S. International Ocean Freight Delivery System is unprepared to deal with growing volumes of cargo flowing through our major ports. If we don't change, we can't grow. In 2017, our FMC supply chain innovation teams recommended a national port information system to provide end-to-end visibility in our international ocean freight delivery system. Now is the time to move forward with this recommendation, harmonize our supply chain, leap over existing problems, and boost American competitiveness and our economy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be glad to discuss my preliminary recommendations from my investigation with you, and of course, answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Dye. We will now move on to member questions. Each member will be recognized for 5 minutes, and I will start with Chairman DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity. And Mr. I want to commend you for the work that you did for the commission's rule that provided for demurrage and detention guidelines, so ocean carriers can know what's reasonable, what's not. But I'm told by many shippers that the detention and demurrage rule is very good, but we also find that the carriers continue to issue the same, you know, demurrage and detention charges, which the rule declares to be unreasonable. And you just said you don't need further authority. How do we get enforcement?
Well, I have a couple recommendations. It's unfortunate that the good carriers are going to suffer as well as the ones that we know are not following the rule. How do we know? Because they tell their customers who immediately tell us. Plus, we had a huge information demand. We'll follow those up with law enforcement interviews from all of them. I'm going to recommend that all of our ocean carriers have what corporate organizations have called compliance officers. Someone who can work directly with us, not part of their general counsel's office, who is accountable and responsible for government compliance. And there are a couple other recommendations along those lines. But as I said, we didn't get as many complaints as we wanted because our exporters are concerned about retaliation. Now, I can assure you and the members of the subcommittee and all of my export colleagues that that is a violation of the Shipping Act currently. And we would take prompt and decisive action if we heard about any carrier actually retaliating against any exporter or any other supply chain actor for coming to the FEC. So we encourage them to provide us with the complaints. As I said, we're going to continue our law enforcement actions. And also, this is very resource intensive. And so I haven't actually discussed this with the chairman fully, but I believe we also need regular Bureau of Enforcement audits of ocean carriers, especially for demurrage and detention, so we can continually be aware of their behavior. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I've heard the same thing about intimidation. I appreciate your strong words in that area, that that is a very clear violation, and that you will, in those cases, take action. But can FMC, and this is either to you or the chair, can you self-initiate, or
Yes.
You can self-initiate?
Yes, in fact, we're doing it now.
Okay.
We have started. Please go ahead, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, we can self-initiate, and I might add that I think self-initiating in some cases is essential here, because one of the things that would help bring more cases from those shippers and private parties is if they saw that they could actually win cases and how to win those cases. And so naturally, they may not want to stick their neck out to be one of the first ones, but once we show that, there are also some other rules that we have that I do think it would make it easier. I've said for a long time that the way we interpret this particular part of the Shipping Act, we require that a plaintiff prove that the wrong occurred on a quote normal, customary, and continuous basis. So if they can prove it happened, but it only happened once or even a couple of times, but the carrier can say, look, that wasn't our actual practice. That was just a mistake. They might not win the case. They probably wouldn't win the case. So that also could be changed. But as Commissioner Dye points out, we do already have that authority. It may be useful to have Congress weigh in, but we do have that authority already.
Okay. Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I regret that I'm not going to. I have unfortunately an appointment which I must keep shortly, so I won't be able to hear or much of the second panel, but I'm hoping to hear interesting ideas and potential solutions from them, and also at any point from the chair or Commissioner Dye, because we just can't continue down this path. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman DeFazio. Next, we'll move on to Ranking Member Gibbs.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for the witnesses for being here. I have a chart I find kind of interesting. It's the Port of Los Angeles monthly container volumes, and it has 2019, 2020, and into 2021 now. And obviously, we saw a drop off in 2020, the first 6-7 months of the year from 2019, and then a surge happened in late July, early August of last year, and the surge continues. And the surge continues here through April. This chart is significantly higher than 2019. So I guess my first question is, do you see structural changes in our supply chain? You can anticipate that these volumes of cargo are going to stay where they are at, or do you think they'll come back down after we work through some backlogs, or do you think there's been enough consumer behavioral changes and just dynamic changes that we're going to see higher volumes, consistently higher than what we had in 2019 before the pandemic? I guess I'd ask the chairman first.
Thank you, Ranking Member Gibbs. Yeah, you're quite right. Most ports in this country have seen about 12 months of cargo volume go through in about 4 months. And a lot of that is due to backlog, but it is also due to a continually high demand. Of course, it always depends exactly what you mean by structural changes, but I don't see anything structural. I think a lot of this has to do with our economy, which, thanks in part to Congress and the former president and the current president, you've kept very strong. And the demand for exports as people were sitting at home. Problem is now they're demanding exports because they're going back out in the world and seeing each other. And my 7-year-old daughter is probably going to get twice as many Christmas presents this year because last year her grandparents couldn't see her and this year they can. So for all of those reasons, I expect demand to continue to be high into next year. But the structure hasn't changed. And indeed, this is a volatile industry. As Commissioner Dye pointed out, it's always had highs and lows, and will indeed, the rates will eventually come down as the demand comes down.
Okay, so you're saying, you said the rates are going to come down, because we have seen rates, in some instances, I've been reported of triple-digit increases in the rates.
They may still go up more before they go down, but they will eventually go down. Your question was, is there some sort of structural change in the way imports and exports work? And I don't think so. I think this particular pandemic we've never had anything like this in the history of modern shipping. And so it is an anomaly. I don't think it changes the overall economics of trade.
Also, a question came up about maybe we have more limited hours of operation at our ports in the United States compared to our ports around the world that maybe work 24/7. Is that true that our ports don't work 24/7, or is that an issue?
Certainly compared to countries like China with different labor systems, et cetera. But and it would be helpful. I think I was just in the New York, New Jersey port last week, and they do have extended hours and are going into weekends as needed. Part of the problem is a chicken and egg problem. If they open up the port for more hours, sometimes people aren't used to going, and then they stop. And the trucking companies and the shippers don't necessarily adjust their schedules permanently unless they know it's going to be permanent. So you've got that little issue there. But it would certainly help. It wouldn't be the be all and end all, though, because up and down the supply chain.
I'm going to run out of time, so I want to jump over to Commissioner Dye. With your fact-finding 29, are you seeing ways you think that we can squeeze more capacity out of our ports and our intermodal relationships?
Well, Mr. Gibbs, I just wanted to add one concerning capacity. I just wanted to add one thing to the chairman's remarks. I found from an organization called Sea Intelligence. They're a very well-regarded organization, and they believe that the boom in United States demand is not declining, It may be softening in the rest of the world, interestingly, but if that's the case, then our ocean carriers who can move their ships anywhere to get cargo may increase their capacity in United States trades, and that will be good for the demand
I just got one quick question I want to get into.
capacity.
Mrs. Dye, is our smaller shippers are seeing huge freight rate increases and outright refusal to deal with the shippers. What action could the FMC has planned to address concerns of the smaller shippers so they don't get pushed out of the market?
Yes, Mr. Gibbs, I know as far as those violations of the law are concerned, our general counsel's very seriously considering all of those allegations. But as far as small shippers go, there's a very unused section of the Shipping Act concerning shippers associations. We encourage our small shippers to band together to leverage their cargo volumes and get better rates and other things of parts of service that they might want to get from ocean carriers. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. Mr. Maffei, we recently gotten reports of shipping companies refusing to carry cargoes, charging excessive detention and demurrage fees, and canceling contracts. Do these actions violate the Shipping Act? If so, why hasn't the FMC taken more meaningful action?
It certainly depends on the circumstances of all of those different actions. But I'm very concerned that that many of those things are violations of the Shipping Act, particularly if a carrier is refusing to even offer a container at any price to an exporter. That to me is refusing to deal. And I should say that these are my own opinions. I would not drag Commissioner Dye necessarily into these or the full commission. It's a commission of 5 independent members. But my own opinion is that would be a violation of the Shipping Act. I also think the detention demurrage practices that we've seen, at least the ones we've heard about, are certainly violations. And in terms of the contracts, that is a little more tricky. I will say that the commission is not allowed to, according to the current Shipping Act, adjudicate whether contracts have been broken. You may want to take a look at that. I do believe that the commission should maybe have a bigger role in reviewing contracts for clauses that are violations of the Shipping Act. And it may be helpful if there is, in practice, it's more blurry about whether something is a contract violation or a violation of the Shipping Act within the contract. In terms of what we're doing, I mean, Commissioner Dye is running a very vigorous investigation of all these things. You have to have evidence. There's the Administrative Procedures Act. We do have to present evidence in court. We do have to be able to prove that these things are violations, and the law is fairly vague about what it means to be reasonable. So those things do take some time. I have every confidence in Commissioner Dye and our team that we will get to the bottom of all of these instances.
Let me continue on that. Why has it taken so long for the FMC to get more involved and yield a better result to date? And two, what can we do to enhance the communication with the shipping carriers to get to a better result?
Yeah, why is it taking so long to resolve? I mean, we've been working hard since the beginning. I think that it is difficult for these things to emerge. Again, there are these barriers. They're not in the law, but there's certainly barriers like fear of retaliation that is keeping individual shippers from filing their own complaints. They don't have to wait for us, but they're not doing it. So then we definitely want to step in. I do think that resources, when you have this much information flow coming in, resources are important. I made sure as soon as I became chairman that Commissioner Dye had the exact people that she needed and the resources she needed. But like her, and we have discussed this, I would like to do a full audit of each and every of the 9 main container lines, a forensic audit, whether or not we've gotten complaints about them, particularly on their detention and demurrage practices, sort of see what they're doing in terms of billing, in terms of other kinds of things that are causing havoc for the shippers. But I don't know if we have the resources for that. So that is part of it. In terms of what we can do to make things more accessible, we do have a Department of Consumer Affairs and Dispute Resolution. It can be very effective, but to be perfectly honest with you, most of the calls it gets are from passengers, not from shippers. And so I have been looking into ways to make it more more communicating with shippers and truckers. One thing I will do, if I can, make sure I can get enough consensus, but I think I can, is to have a particular go-to person, probably based in Caters, where particularly exporters can go, call that one person, and that one person will be an expert on various things they can do and all of their options. Another thing we can do is try to publicize better this, our Caters program. It's always a little thorny when federal agencies publicize themselves, but I do think that would be helpful if we can do it in a targeted way.
Thank you. In your testimony, you said that you, quote, want to look at the billing and appeal policies for detention and demurrage charges. How is this different than Commissioner Dye's fact-finding 29?
It isn't different. I think it works with her fact-finding as well, but basically her fact-finding is an investigative fact-finding. And I would also want to look into what we can do to maybe clarify things further. There have been some proposals out there that we do an additional rule on detention and demurrage, and I think that might be valuable. It wouldn't necessarily, we would need to still do all the similar enhancements in our enforcement capability, but things like sending bills out on detention and demurrage, billing billing a shipper. Can I be heard okay?
Yes.
Okay, I'll sit a little closer just in case. But we want to, these carriers sometimes bill a shipper, and we don't believe sometimes that, or at least the shipper doesn't believe that they should have been billed because the detention and demurrage is unreasonable. So they complain and they go through a big complaining process. And indeed, in the end, the carrier often says, "Oh, we were wrong, sorry." But they sent the bill out. They had a fairly complicated appeal system. I think that in itself may be unreasonable. If it's unreasonable to make the charge, then it's unreasonable to send the bill, except in very rare instances. And so that's one thing that both Commissioner Dye and I have discussed what we can do about that.
Thank you. I'm running out of time here, so I'm trying to get one last question in here for Commissioner Dye.
My memory is the chairman never runs out of time.
It's true, but we try to adhere to the time frame. Ms. Dye, in the second panel, Ms. Jacobson is going to testify that even after containers have been loaded on the terminal dock, carriers have changes return dates, which incur demurrage fee charges. That seems unreasonable to me. Why hasn't the FMC addressed this issue?
You're exactly right, Mr. Chairman, that the confusion between ocean carriers and marine terminals persists, and exporters get caught in the middle. This is one of the 4 major problems that our 9 teams addressed at the beginning of the fact-finding. So, since this is the major problem for exporters, the investigations that our Bureau of Enforcement is conducting now features in this problem. And so we look forward to the results of the investigation because we decided that this was, I am not involved in the actual investigations or the choosing of carriers who may be investigated, but I did insist that this problem with earliest return date and demurrage unreasonably, potentially, in these situations should be our highest priority. And we've already started those investigations that I said. Thank you.
Commissioner Dye, what other authority does the FMC need in order to enforce your demurrage and detention rule in an expeditious manner?
I don't believe we need any more. We will work with you on whatever you would like for us to consider. But I don't think that we need more. We decided to use an interpretative rule because it's flexible. For instance, we've heard about waivers that many carriers have granted on demurrage and detention in certain circumstances. And we didn't discuss waivers in the rule itself, but obviously a complete waiver during congestion is reasonable. And so I will be delighted to talk to you more about this, but I think we're okay for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Dye. I do encourage you and your commission to give that a little bit more thought, because at the end of the day, if there is delay, it comes back to you saying you need no more authority. You got everything you have, and yet delays occur, it's going to be back on you. So I really encourage you to give that question a little bit more thought.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
With that, I will move on to Representative Lowenthal.
Thank you, Chairman. My first question is for Chairman Maffei. First of all, it's good to see you, Mr. Chairman. We served together in the Congress before, and I'm just honored to watch your progression at the FMC. My question is just some elaboration of what you've already talked about. Through this pandemic, have you received the support and the encouragement that you need from both the ocean carriers and the terminal operators? Have they been supportive of your investigatory process?
Well, thank you for the question, Congressman Lowenthal. It's great to see you as well. I do hope to get out to Los Angeles at some point in the near future now that this pandemic has lifted somewhat, sometime this summer. I would say that they've definitely made themselves accessible to us. I don't think there's any doubt about that. When we call, try to get on the phone, it may take a day or so, but we usually can get not only the U.S. CEO, but usually the global CEO on the phone. Whether they've given us support, I think it's difficult for me to try to put myself into their place. What they say is basically they'll talk about how what they're doing are for economic reasons. And then particularly a question like exports, which I've been, made a couple of rounds of calls. I will argue that, okay, well, it might cost you a little bit for that opportunity cost of that empty container, but in the long run, you will have a better, more reliable export customer. And frankly, you will look better to the Congress and the American public, and that will help both your line and the industry. I would say they're pretty receptive to that, but these are big organizations, big businesses, and you don't always get that receptiveness trickling down to every level of the company. So, while I would say that they have been receptive and supportive, it's deeds, not words. And so we need to do what Commissioner Dye is doing, and we need to keep the pressure on them in terms of making sure that we're scrutinizing the carrier lines to make sure there's no violation of the Shipping Act and the alliances.
Thank you. Before I get to Commissioner Dye, I have a question for her. I just wanted to say that, I do represent the Port of Long Beach, and during this pandemic, I just want to say the ports, our partners in labor, and so many others have worked heroically during this crisis. We've had, large amounts of the pandemic have impacted our ports, and yet they've come through. We need more investments, as Ms. in ports, as Chairman DeFazio has said. And I'm hoping that the FMC moves forward swiftly and holds, if there are bad actors, holds them accountable. And I'm hoping that, with our with our reopening and our global vaccine efforts, we're going to restore stability throughout the world. I mean, we're still not out of it. But I want to make sure that our system is resilient, and I'm going to ask some of the others in the second panel about that resiliency. But Commissioner Dye, and I understand that you are not able to speak about the comment on the ongoing investigation, but can you provide the committee with when we can expect to hear the findings or the conclusions from your findings?
Well, we really haven't set the order to me from the commission doesn't have a date because we had no idea and still don't really know how long the pandemic will last. In the very beginning, we were engaged in getting storage at ports for cargo that was on the water. There was nowhere to put it because we were closed. And so there have been several phases of the investigation. I'm free to discuss my own recommendations, several of which the chairman has mentioned. Of course, those would take final commission action. But my team is working expeditiously, and we're not. You can be sure that we're not dragging our feet.
Good.
But one thing that I wanted to point out. I believe in rewarding good behavior as well as bad behavior, and several of the ocean carrier CEOs, USA, have rolled up their sleeves and gotten very involved in helping us for the major ocean carriers, especially on the problems with container return. And we always appreciate that. Want more of it.
Here's a question, it may be very oversimplified. Both you and the chairman have talked about some of the violations or the problems with detention and demurrage charges. Can you elaborate for the committee? What specifically have you been hearing about those kinds of
this was
violations?
I can emphasize to you that if we were going to roll out one of the largest thing, one of the most major things the FMC has ever done, for the first time in the world, these charges, shippers everywhere I've ever been internationally complain bitterly about these charges, and we took it on. But we certainly would not have chosen to roll it out during a pandemic when everybody was working from home and we were unable to travel to talk directly to companies about the rule. But I think that it's clear, and as I said, we are taking, because we didn't get factual complaints that are necessary to move forward in investigations from very many entities.
Thank you, Commissioner Dye. If you could just wrap up, we have to move on.
Of course. But we're moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. We will move on to Representative Brownlee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate you allowing me to be here today. This is not my normal committee, but I am here because of my farmers in my district. My district in Ventura County in California is heavily a farming community, and my farmers many of my farmers rely on export markets and are paying, triple the price. So I know that FMC is supposed to ensure fair shipping practices. We're talking about that. So my question is, what is the FMC doing to make is FMC doing anything around agriculture, specifically in terms of trying to resolve these high prices? We do feed our country.
Yes, Congresswoman Brownlee, you certainly do. I'm not sure if you remember, but when I was in Congress, my district, which had a city in it, but also had substantial agriculture exports. I'm from New York, but I'm from upstate New York, and we had a lot of dairy, soybeans, and other kinds of fruit, particularly apples. So I really empathize with these exporters. We are trying to do things in terms of, I mentioned the calls that I'm making, and I mentioned that we are taking very careful scrutiny about whether carriers are refusing to deal. They're not allowed to do that. You have to at least make a container available. That said, though, it's important to note that while in the purposes section of our legislation, it does say that we are to promote the growth and development of United States exports. It says that we are to promote the growth and development of exports through competitive and efficient ocean transportation and by placing a greater reliance on the marketplace. The 1984 Act was enacted at a time of deregulation and reliance on the marketplace. And by and large, it has worked for us in that one of the reasons why exporters have been able to succeed is that shipping rates have been relatively low through most of the last 20 years. That said, though, now that they're much higher, we don't have very many tools to address those costs. It would be, we're not allowed to interfere in the market or set rates. And so that can be very frustrating for someone like me who does very much value those exporters and trying to find a way to help them. Certainly, the stuff we've already discussed about improving our consumer affairs outreach to exporters, so that we can take each individual exporter may have very different circumstances depending on what they grow and where they are in the country, et cetera. But we can at least give them individual guidance as to what their options are. But we are a little bit tied by that provision, for better or worse, but the provision that keeps us from out of the market, from interfering in the market.
Thank you for that. And by the way, it is good to see you. And thank you for what you're doing in your position today. I guess the other question that I have is, do you do any kind of engagement with the U.S. Trade representative in terms of some of these prices? Some may be able to be mitigated somewhat through trade policy.
The truth is that I think we need to do more. I have been in touch with the Office of the USTR when I was a commissioner, particularly on some of the China issues that we were seeing in the last couple of years. In terms of we have under other acts some responsibilities in terms of making sure that there's not discrimination against U.S. trade. That said, I think it would be very helpful for us to have more contact with them, and I will take your question as an impromptu request on your part for me to get in touch with them and discuss that. So I appreciate the suggestion.
Well, thank you for that. And my time is about to run out, but both of you were talking about your ability to self-initiate. Roughly, can you give me a number in terms of how many self-initiated claims are underway at this moment in time?
I'll defer to Commissioner Dye, but I imagine that'll be a difficult question for her to give you a specific on.
We have quite a few. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Congresswoman Brownlee, we will get back to you when appropriate.
Yes, thank you.
Great, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We will now move on to Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate that. My questions will be for Commissioner Dye. Commissioner Dye, you just mentioned that there are a number of self-referred complaints or investigations. Have there been any enforcement actions, actual penalties handed down?
No. No, not yet, but this is a new way for us to deal with this particular section of the law. But we were not content to wait any longer for particular complaints. So we used what we've had, and we're using them they are violations of the Shipping Act actions, and they're under investigation now.
So what about unreasonable detention and demurrage? I mean, you guys had interpretive rule. I mean, do they deal more with that, or do they deal with the refusal of foreign flagged shippers to take American, particularly agricultural exports to Asia?
They deal with the demurrage and detention charges as a result of the confusion in the marketplace.
So, Commissioner, and just palms up here, I mean, Congressman Garamendi and I have been talking about some potential legislative solutions that we think would give FMC some additional powers, I think, to better respond to this marketplace. Now, you've said today that you don't think you need additional authority. And so I want to get my arms around that a bit more. I mean, it seems like the ocean shippers, they don't think you have the authority. I mean, they don't appear to be running scared. They don't appear to be living up to the letter of the law, either in what we hear are relatively widespread refusal to accept American exports, and then also related to the detention and demurrage issue you mentioned. So when they're not obeying the law, shouldn't that give us cause to believe that they think you don't have the power to hold them accountable?
Well, I appreciate I appreciate that perspective, because we're certainly not happy with the behavior of some of them, but some of them are in compliance and keep in close touch on the application of the rule. And so we want to make sure that we target the people who are not complying and make sure they know that we mean it. So I always am careful when I'm interviewing our shippers to say, wait a minute, all of them? And they'll say, well, no, not all. We understand people are furious. I have to say, the stories that I've heard about, canceling bookings and make us furious too. But these people are longtime colleagues of ours.
So
Congressman, can I ask your indulgence to address that as well?
Yes. Oh yeah, Mr. Chairman, go ahead. Certainly.
Yeah. So one, I think what Commissioner Dye has been saying is we have the authority to enforce the detention and demurrage piece of
Correct.
this. I think it's another question that we'll leave to another, congressman or whatever, if we have the authority to do all these things, particularly the exports, et cetera. So that's a different question. I do want to, though, quickly say on whether the lines believe this or not. I do think it depends on the line and sometimes the people within the line. But I will say this: we need to get these cases done. We need to get them through, and the reason is we need to set a credible deterrent. The only way they're really going to believe it, it doesn't matter what we write or what we say, what we clarify, is there needs to be instances where they do it and it ends up not paying on them. So it's very, very important that we do that deterrent. And one thing you might want to consider is if we were allowed to not just get fines that would go to the U.S. Treasury, but reparations that would actually go back to the aggrieved shipper. That's vague or not really allowed. I mean, that's confusing. That would be a useful change in the Shipping Act. Thank you for letting me address it.
Oh yeah, sure. Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would say a few things with the time I have left. Number one, I agree wholeheartedly. We need a credible deterrent. It does seem like there continue to be bad actions and bad actors within this space. And as we've talked about a fair amount today, it has had a substantial ripple impact throughout the American manufacturing and particularly agricultural sectors. Number two, I take to heart your suggestion, Mr. Chairman, that perhaps some additional authority around this trade equivalency for U.S. exports could be helpful for FMC. And then I also take to heart your suggestion that perhaps Congressman Garamendi and I could also look at some reparation, making whole some of the harm that's been caused as just opposed to penalties. Thank you very much. That's very helpful. And the Congressman and I will absolutely continue to move forward in those areas. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. We'll now move on to Representative Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the hearing and for the commissioners and Chairman McPhee. Thank you. It's a delight to see you on the screen. Love to see you in person here next time out. We've got a problem, folks. We've got a problem in which the shipping industry is able to discriminate against American exporters, plain and simple. It may be because they can make a heck of a lot more money sending those containers empty rather than back to the Western Pacific, than allowing them to be here long enough to be loaded up with American exports. It is a serious problem. It's been discussed here by others. I want to follow up on the issues raised by my colleague, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, and this goes directly to Mr. McPhee. Can you please confirm whether the Federal Maritime Commission currently lacks the legal authority and the statutory directive to ensure export opportunities for U.S. exporters and promote reciprocal trade, foreign commerce, in your regulation under the current Shipping Act?
Certainly, the Act does not have any provision to give us the tools to provide for reciprocal trade. That doesn't necessarily mean that I think that that's where it should go. That obviously does involve, other segments of the government like the USTR, et cetera. But let me just say that I'm happy to answer that in more detail, either in a smaller meeting or by in writing. But I'll just say that we don't have the tools to really address any of the market issues that involve that exports, that carriers make so much less on exports, so they can do other things.
Thank you for that confirmation. You do not have the tools presently. Was it Adam Smith said the invisible hand of the market? Yes, and most people don't read the next chapter, which is there may be the necessity to regulate that market so that it actually performs, so that there is a balance of power. In this case, a balance of power between the importers, who are able to receive several times more pay for a container moving from the Western Pacific to America than an exporter from the United States. So, Mr. Johnson has already brought to our attention that he and I are working on a draft piece of legislation that I would expect would give you the power to look at and to provide the necessary regulation, as Adam Smith said, might be necessary under certain circumstances, for that there be a proper balance in the free market system. We would suggest that there are several things. I'll put this on the table now, requiring ocean carriers to include statement of compliance with the regulations, prohibiting ocean carriers from declining all cargo bookings for exports. I note that Hapag Lloyd told the soybean exporters, American soybean exporters, sorry, but we're not going to ship, period. That must not happen in the future. And so we would prohibit that in our draft legislation and perhaps in the final law that we would hope would become a result of that. Also requiring the FMC to post publicly on its website all findings of false certifications by ocean carriers and penalties that the FMC might have under the current law, and also establishing ongoing duty responsibilities for the FMC to ensure export opportunities for U.S. exporters and promote reciprocal trade. Yep, there ought to be a law, and we're going to work on that, Mr. Johnson and I, together with others on this committee, that what is currently happening to American exporters is not fair. It is not justified, except if you want to be a price gouger, which apparently some of these shippers want to be, taking advantage of the Asian exporters who are willing to pay anything to get their products to the United States, and immediately return that container empty so they can do it once again to the detriment of American exporters. So we're going to proceed with that. Mr. Fafihi, you seem to be amenable to such a action. Would you care to comment? Should we or should we not take steps to carry out Adam Smith's second paragraph, second chapter, that is, sometimes there needs to be a regulatory balance?
If you could do that briefly, we're running out of time.
Let me just say that I certainly want to work with you on that. I think it's important to take on the issue. I think we should discuss the specific provisions to make sure there are as minimal unintended consequences as possible. But I will also say that we can't just scapegoat the carriers. I know that they're an easier scapegoat. Some of the so-called price gouging is going on in just a few of these intermediaries who purchase space on the ship and then resell it for huge premiums to exporters who just need that, or sometimes importers as well. So there's good eggs and bad eggs in all of these baskets, and certainly it would be good to have more tools for the FMC. So I look forward to working with you and your colleague, Mr. Johnson, on that.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you. We'll now move on to Representative Van Drew.
Good morning, Mr. Maffei and Ms. Dye. Thank you for coming to testify before this committee on issues that are so critical to the United States, our supply chain security. We've heard about it over and over again with good reason. Over the past year, thousands of ships have left American ports devoid of cargo. These vessels go to China, fill up with steel, clothing, electronics, toys, you name it, they've got it. They come to the west coast of the United States, unload these cheap Chinese products, and then head back to China as quickly as they possibly can. Once again, they leave with absolutely nothing, zero, made in America. This phenomenon is extremely troubling to all of us. This seems symptomatic of a deep and fundamental weakness in our supply chain. That fundamental weakness in our supply chain and the entire global supply chain is exponentially increasing dependence on China. Here are some of the statistics on the Chinese market share, focusing just on maritime commerce industry. Over the last year, China's export container volume increased by 20%, only in 1 year. China produces, this is an unbelievable statistic to me, China produces 96% of the world's shipping containers. China controls just about 50% of the world's shipbuilding market. These trends, combined with the current state of the American maritime industry, present not only an economic threat, but a national security threat. As evidenced in World War II, a nation's industrial power can quickly be shifted to military production. This is particularly true of shipbuilding. In the event of the conflict with China in Taiwan or in the South China Sea, the United States needs a strong industrial base independent of Chinese supply chains. I can only hope that you can explain to me how this has all happened, what it means for our country and the world, and whether we are prepared for the worst. So my first question would be, how has China established such dominance of the shipbuilding and container shipping industries?
I think you mean container building industries.
Correct.
I mean, that is pretty much outside of.
Well, actually, both.
Yeah, exactly, both. In terms of the manufacturing, it's for the same reasons that China is manufacturing so many other things, because you can manufacture stuff anywhere and actually for years ship it for very low cost. Even now, with these huge costs for importing, you're still talking about the ocean shipping costing about, say, 60 cents for a pair of shoes. Now, 2 years ago, it was 15 cents for a pair of shoes. Now it's 60 cents. But that very inexpensive shipping cost has allowed China to gain advantages from low labor, low materials costs, low regulations, and almost no regulations in some areas. So that's beyond our purview, but it is one of the reasons why China has gained that. I will tell you, Congressman, that one of the silver linings to the very dark cloud of all these record high freight rates is with rates, particularly sometimes going to say $10,000 a container in some cases to go from Shanghai to LA. The silver lining is I've heard that there are some consumer goods and large shippers that are now contemplating manufacturing at least some of those products in America again. So part of the reason, frankly, if you ask why this happened, it is actually the low shipping rates for all those years that has allowed it to happen. China isn't exactly dominant because, I mean, for instance, carriers based in Switzerland and Denmark, each one of those has more of the market share worldwide than China's carrier does.
Not to interrupt you.
Yep.
Thank you for your answer
Yep.
so far, but why with even containers? I mean, 96% of the world's shipping containers, and I know you say it's beyond our purview, but I think it has to be under our purview in some way because, you know, we place regulations upon ourselves of all types, but we exempt China. We place regulations on ourselves that reduce our productivity, but we don't do that to China. We place regulations on ourselves that really hurt our economy in many ways, and yet we don't do that to Russia or many other countries. So I quite frankly don't understand that. You know, and I know I'm going to deviate a little, but you know, we can't build a pipeline, but Russia can. I don't understand that. I don't understand why we have a two-tiered system here. One is they can do anything and we can do nothing. And I know that's not all your fault, but it is under our purview in a sense because it concerns us and it concerns us into the future, quite frankly, for the future of the nation.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not implying that it's not under your purview or the purview of the country or the Congress. It's simply not in the FMC set of responsibilities that you've given us. It goes more to trading policy, et cetera. So, but I will tell you this, I'm certainly concerned about China's dominance in building in these areas, and it does affect the industry, and we do monitor that.
In what ways might China leverage its growing influence in our maritime commerce?
Mr. Van Drew, you're out of time. If we could just finish your question so you could submit an answer for the record.
I could talk about this forever. It's a really huge, dominant problem that we cannot ignore. It is under our purview, and I thank you, Chairman, for your latitude, and I yield back.
Thank you. With that, we'll move on to Representative Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and it's good to see the Chairman of the FMC as well, former colleague. Appreciate seeing you, as well as Commissioner Dye. Good to see both of you. I have a little bit different twist on this question. First off, the comments from Mr. Johnson and Ms. Garamendi are right up the alley with what I'm hearing in my district. And the first question I have, and you may have covered this earlier, I apologize for being late. Does this problem tend to be focused on in the natural resources and resources industry, or is this part of is this going to manufactured goods as well? Because people I hear from in my district, it's mainly lumber that's getting kicked out of containers. So what's the record from the FMC on this?
Yeah, if you're looking for actual statistics, we'll have to get back to you, but it's mostly, agricultural type goods, the kind of goods that are very heavy and, are sometimes more difficult to get to the ports because you have to transport them. Certainly lumber is in that category. Manufactured goods, obviously there's far, far fewer of those being exported from the United States, but we have not, at least I have not heard anecdotally many complaints from those folks. The higher paid exports, the higher value exports do still have to pay a lot more for a container, but those are the ones that are going. As I mentioned, exports overall are up. They're just not up compared to how much the imports are up. And they're up, but it does tend to be those higher value exports that are getting those containers because they're the ones that can pay the highest premium. As opposed to, unfortunately, some of these agricultural exporters who just have very low margins. I mean, that's the sad thing about American agriculture.
And I'm also trying to piece some of this together because I'm getting complaints in my district from a couple of different areas where container ships are using federally recognized anchorages in order to anchor until they get a spot at the Port of Seattle or even the Port of Vancouver in BC. And so, so getting complaints because these container ships are showing up in places they never showed up before. And I was wondering about whether or not the FMC can take a stricter approach to existing contracts or contractors between exporters and shippers, and would that help solve this supply chain problem? Would that help move container ships faster in order to get them out of these places where they have been using federally recognized anchorages in order to alleviate that problem?
Yeah, you're a bit out of my lane, Congressman Larson, in terms of the anchorages and how they're used. That's more of a Coast Guard or potentially the Maritime Administration. But in terms of your question about contracts, I will admit it's hard to draw direct A and B and say, well, if we had more authority over maritime contracts, it would lead to fewer ship lines. But I will say that as I've mentioned, some clarification of the FMC's ability to review contracts and take steps if we feel those contracts are not reasonable or have provisions that aren't reasonable would be helpful. As I say now, the current law says that contract disputes have to go to a different venue. That it was well-meaning, and I certainly understand that. We don't want to become a contract court here. That would lead to volumes that just don't make any sense of cases. But that said, though, we need to have some additional flexibility, I think, to look at those contracts and to take action when they are violative of the Shipping Act.
All right, that's fine. We're just looking for solutions in a very tight supply chain environment right now, and so I appreciate.
The best thing we can do is frankly continue to try to increase the capacity so there just aren't those ship lines. I mean, nobody wins in those ship lines. Everybody loses. The shippers lose, the ports lose, the carriers lose. They don't want their ships idle either. So that's the main thing we have.
And we get the phone calls, as you're aware.
Yeah, I've heard them.
All right, great. That's it for me. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. We'll go to Representative LaMalfa next.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate being able to sit in on the committee today on this extremely important topic towards having to do with all shipping, but I think especially for California and California agriculture. I'm pleased we can have this opportunity to talk about this container situation. It's really crippling a lot of our ability to export. So, there's been a lot of good conversation already in committee here, but one area I want to underline a little bit too is on it really affects everybody across the board, whether it's agriculture, getting their products actually through the port system into the hands of the people that are supposed to be purchasing it, especially under our trade deals we have with China. And those trade deals don't really seem to be being held up, not meeting the mark. But so that has the effect on the producer. But let's talk about the truckers for a moment. They're really caught in the middle on this as well. If they cannot get their cargo that they brought in loaded and off their back, then they start running into fees based on waiting in line at the port for a long time. The driver themselves has the challenge of hours. Their hours are curtailed because of they're on duty. So they're running into fees and fines because of that situation. And then if they don't get to unload at the port, then they got to wait somewhere with all that. So this certainly does have a ripple effect through a lot of people in the field, in the trucking, as well as what we have with the port. But let me move to something more specific on the issue with our. Let me ask Commissioner Dye. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Our markets, are pretty open to foreign imports, but we don't seem to have the same level of enforcement or the goodwill, I guess, to require them to take our goods back with them in the turnaround at the ports. As I was mentioning on the trade deals we have, They don't seem to be honoring them. When you have a situation where the statistics I have, if a container comes from Shanghai to LA, the exporter of Chinese or Asian products is paying nearly $6,000 for the use of that container on that ship. And my figures are the container returning from LA to Shanghai, the price for that container is just under $800. So the difference between 6,000 and 800. So where we're caught at a disadvantage for the incentive isn't to fill our container, isn't to fill the container in our port with our stuff, but to just get it back to China and other Asian areas as fast as possible. That's obviously what we're talking about and what we're battling here. So we suffer here. Our ag suffers. Our products that are made in America suffer. So if we can't require them to take our items back on export, then what is the best way to stop this unfair situation, Commissioner Dye? Because can we hit them with fees and fines on that, and to other ways to penalize this problem? Again, I don't think they're upholding the spirit or maybe the technical efforts of our trade agreements by doing it this way. And our people are left holding the bag. And is it just a matter of the American consumer that they need to somehow be educated on buying less imports and somehow more domestically produced products? It seemed like that was a pretty strong emphasis until recently. What do you think on that?
Well, I appreciate that. I think that some of our ocean carriers carry a lot of exports. It's their business model, and some don't. Of course, that can change depending on prices. I agree with you that some of these prices are incredible. As the chairman said, these spot rates are outlined. And
Yeah,
our exporters suffer from that. This problem with container.
Real quickly, can we put our finger on the scale somehow in order to tilt that back in our favor a bit?
That's probably beyond the Shipping Act itself as a policy issue. As the chairman said, we'll be glad to talk to you and look at anything that you may like us to consider. We're looking at going back to container depots. There's a new collapsible container that many say will be to the advantage of exporters because they can carry more. And so in 2010, I was looking at load boards in trucking stops to see if we could use that technology. But we have several things we're going to look at because we agree with you about the problem.
Okay. Well, thank you, Commissioner. I would appreciate the chance to follow up with you on that.
Thank you.
I like that. I like those thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Are there any further questions from members of the subcommittee for this panel? Representative Gibbs?
Yeah. Thank you, Commissioner Dye. I want to follow up a little bit, I think, on Mr. Larson's question about your data transparency initiative. Would that help on the dwell time for vessels? It seems like to me vessels wait in Anchorage, and for the logistical challenges, if we made that so they know what's going to happen, your transparency initiative, can you just reflect quickly how that might be helpful?
Yes, Mr. Gibbs, you're exactly right. The end-to-end supply chain visibility that we considered in 16 and 17 after the LA transportation congestion in 16 and 17. It's a great idea. We're dedicated to it. Los Angeles has done a lot of work on that. We talked to a lot of experts who believe that if you tell people what they need to know when they need to know it, then they behave rationally, and a lot of these lines and bottlenecks can go away. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. You're back.
Congressman, could you he indulge me just to address the same question?
Sure.
I actually want to echo it because I think that this is absolutely key. Yes, in physical infrastructure is important, but this informational infrastructure is what I call it, is maybe the solution to avoid this happening again, at least as bad if we ever do have this kind of surge in imports. The National Port Information System would provide end-to-end visibility. And this better data management systems, the more information sharing would be absolutely essential to shippers being able to get their stuff to the port at the right time. If they're exporters, to pick it up at the right time. Congressman LaMalfa mentioned how truckers are just getting caught in the middle. That is so true. And a lot of that is because they don't have information soon enough in order to plan their, when they're going to drop things off, or they're not allowed to drop things off and pick them up at the same time. So I just want to echo this in terms of your thinking. It obviously won't be done overnight, so it doesn't necessarily help an exporter right now. But this is key to improving and increasing the supply part of the supply-demand equation. Thank you for.
Thank you. Seeing no further questions, I would like to thank our first panel witnesses for their testimony. Your contribution to today's discussion has been very informative and helpful. As there are no further questions, I will now call up panel 2. I ask the witness on the panel 2 to please turn their camera on and keep them on for the duration of the panel. I would now like to welcome our next panel witnesses. First, we have Mr. John Butler, President and Chief Executive Officer for the World Shipping Council. 2, we have Ms. Alexis Jacobson, International Account Manager for Bosco Trading LLC on behalf of the U.S. Forage Export Council. 3, we have Mr. Frank Ponce de Leon, Coast Committeeman for the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. 4, we have Mr. Eugene D. Soroka, Executive Director for the Port of Los Angeles. And last, we have Ms. Jen Sorensen, President of the National Pork Producers Council. Thank you for being here today, and I look forward to your testimony. Without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. Since your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee requests that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. With that, Mr. Butler, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Carvajal, Ranking Member Gibbs, and thanks also to the full committee chairman and ranking Mr. DeFazio and Ranking Member Graves, and of course members of the subcommittee. I very much appreciate the invitation to testify today. The record-setting containerized import levels that we have seen over the past year have taxed every link in the global supply chain. And I would just like to touch on a few.
Mr. Butler, could you put your microphone closer to your mouth because we can't hear you?
Certainly. Is that any better?
That's better.
Okay. First question, how did we get here? The title of this hearing really contains the answer, and that is increased demand. Starting in the summer and fall of 2020 and continuing today, Americans with disposable income shifted their spending away from services like restaurants and travel to the purchase of all sorts of goods. And that's from electronics to furniture and other goods to create home offices and to remodel homes. Most of those goods came to the United States on container ships. In 2020, the international containerized supply chain essentially moved a year's worth of cargo in 6 months, and demand remains at record levels today. Ports throughout the world are congested, including here, with ships backed up in anchorages waiting for berths so that they can offload and onload cargo. Inland transportation by truck and rail is also overwhelmed, and cargo is sitting in containers at warehouses waiting to be unloaded and the empty equipment returned so that another shipper can use it. Every part of the supply chain is affected. Second, what have ocean carriers done to respond to this? Ocean carriers have responded by deploying every available ship. As we speak, 99% of the global container fleet is in service. The only ships not at sea are either between charter contracts or in shipyards. Ocean carriers have also bought or leased and deployed every available shipping container. Third, I want to address agricultural exports. There's tremendous interest in this, and ocean carriers fully recognize that individual U.S. agricultural exporters have had difficulty getting equipment. Unfortunately, this is also true for almost every type of shipper in almost every country, and U.S. agricultural exporters are not being singled out. Ocean carriers are working with their customers to make sure that contractual obligations are met. And again, not to minimize individual problems, but U.S. government data show that agricultural exports are up from pre-COVID levels. In addition, it's important to note that less than 15% of all agricultural exports move in containers. Most seaborne ag exports move in bulk ships. The point is not that we don't have problems to address. We absolutely do. But simply to say that we need to understand the context in which those problems arise so that we can respond appropriately. And fourth, and finally, there have been some legislative ideas floated by various organizations in recent days. Some of those proposals, frankly, would add paperwork and do nothing else. And some would invite the FMC to micromanage the international transportation system. Neither approach would make things better. We have heard some proposals from members today, and I look forward to the opportunity to talk further with you about those proposals. We do agree that the best solution really is through supply chain partners working together on a commercial basis. And when that is not enough, as you've heard a lot about today, the FMC has ample authority to address any unreasonable behavior. And I can say, sitting where I do, that the Commission has made it very clear that it will exercise that power. One thing we have to keep in mind is that the markets will moderate as demand and consumption patterns return to normal. In the interim, I can commit to you that the ocean carriers that transport this country's international commerce will do everything in our power to continue to move the historic volumes of cargo that we're moving today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Butler. We will next go to Ms. Alexis Jacobson.
Chairman Carbajal, Ranking Member Gibbs, and members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss these issues facing agriculture exports today. My name is Alexis Jacobson. I'm presenting to you from our farm in Tangent, Oregon, specifically outside the hay storage barn on behalf of the U.S. Forage Export Council, National Hay Association, Agriculture Transportation Coalition as well. Before getting into the specifics, can I give you a quick overview? You'll see in my submitted testimony the daily challenges that our nation's agriculture exports face today, including these. First, the lack of ocean carrier commitment to our American exporters. Ocean carriers continue to leave American exports in the dust as our terminals become overcrowded with loaded import containers and empty containers are sent back on ocean vessels rather than loaded with our goods. Vessel commitments are often being canceled close to the last receiving date, leaving exporters and their goods stranded. All too often, we're given only 1 day notice to pick up an empty container and return it to a marine terminal, and frequently that is impossible. Particularly for farms like ours, a 4-hour drive each way to Tacoma and Seattle, we need steady vessel schedules, steady earliest receiving dates, and steady final receiving dates in order to return cargo and be successful in shipping our goods. Second, we understand that the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated underlying inefficiencies in our supply chain and led to this current situation. However, ocean carriers should not be profiting from these challenges with huge detention and demurrage charges that the FMC has already said are unreasonable. And it is so difficult and time consuming for us, a small and large, and all the exporters to challenge these charges. We need the FMC to have more power to prevent these invoices in the first place. We're getting nickeled and dimed and penalized more and more for just trying to ship our goods to our customers. Between increases in ocean freight and increases in trucking costs, our hay becomes less competitive in a global market every day. Australian hay products will soon outcompete our American hay products. Our truck drivers are spending more time in the lines at the port, causing them to max out their legal hours of service. The next step is to hire additional drivers, but we're already heading into a driver shortage. Truckers for shippers that are farther from marine terminals already stretched these legal hours of service as it is. And we are paying more than ever for record low customer service from the ocean carriers. One simple fix for us to help marine terminals and truck drivers be a little bit more efficient would simply be to add 1 or 2 hours of flex time from 6 to 8 a.m. at the marine terminals. We support this idea, which we first heard at our Agriculture Transportation Coalition meeting with a West Coast terminal operator. All of us exporters have been trying really hard to survive a really difficult shipping situation. We've been telling anyone who will listen. I'm pretty knowledgeable in shipping hay and seed, but I'm not an expert in ocean shipping laws and regulations. That's why I'm here today, in hopes that you will write whatever laws need to be written. We are all glad that the ITC is making proposals to improve the situation. As said, exactly how the laws are written and would work legally is not my expertise, but we do like the objectives: to stop these unfair detention and demurrage charges, to have carriers carry our export cargo instead of heading back with empty containers, and to increase the help the FMC can provide when we need to resolve a particular matter with a carrier. I would like to work with you and the FMC to achieve these objectives. The U.S. exported nearly $1.4 billion in forage last year, generating jobs in rural communities where employment is really needed. Competing internationally is tough enough without the extra burdens imposed by ocean carriers and terminal operators. Through the efforts of companies like ourselves, we offer high-quality forage to overseas dairy farms and cattle ranches. But this means very little if we cannot get our product to our customers. Thank you all. I'm happy to try and answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Jacobson. We will now proceed to Mr. Frank Ponce de Leon.
Good morning, Chairman Carbajal, ranking members Graves and Gibbs, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Frank Ponce de Leon. I'm the International Longshore and Warehouse Union Coast Committee committeeman serving on our highest executive body within the ILWU Coast Longshore Division. I began working as a registered longshoreman in 1982. In my 40 years on the waterfront, I have worked nearly every position on the docks, capping my career as a highly skilled crane operator of the massive ship-to-shore hammerhead cranes. In speaking today, I speak for over 22,000 men and women represented by the ILWU's Coast Longshore Division, working at all 29 ports on the West Coast. The cargo our members unload ends up in every congressional district in the United States. The ILWU Coast Longshore Division shares the subcommittee's concerns about port congestion and container shortages. We believe these problems are linked to the declining investment in both our infrastructure and American port workers. The foreign conglomerates who lease the vast majority of America's marine terminals that are almost all publicly owned, consistently put their own profits over maximizing efficiencies. No one is questioning their right to make money, but they're making those profits operating public ports built on public money and with our taxpayer dollars. The ILW believes that the public infrastructure that makes up our nation's freight supply chain should be used to prioritize the American economy and the American workers. We believe the federal government has a responsibility to stop the slow degrading of our ports and the skilled workforce that has made these ports the best in the world. For example, chassis management and maintenance needs to be brought back to the waterfront. In 2015, The terminal operators divested from the ownership and control of the chassis needed to move containers. This move saved them money and has caused systematic delays, shortages of chassis, and extra steps that haulage carriers have to take. What's ironic, in fact, we currently have a terminal operating under the old chassis model that now is charging shippers a premium for this expedited service. Next, while continuously setting records over the past year, even during the pandemic, we still face manpower shortage at the port, and our employers have now acknowledged that there is a need for a higher skill set of workers. Terminal operators have overly relied on the temporarily casual workers. Casuals are junior workers who make lower wages and receive no benefits. These workers are also not trained in higher skill positions. To effectively meet the demands of the pandemic and other fluctuations in our industry, the ILWU Coastal Longshore Division believes that there needs to be an investment in the promoting and training of longshore workers for long-term employment. The ILWU welcomes expanding gate hours. Terminal operators already have the right to extend hours, but often don't do it. Once again, those decisions seem driven by short-term cost-cutting measures. Extra gate hours supported by extended operations at connecting points in the supply chain may come at an individual cost, but they are critical in reducing cargo backlogs. We also believe the FMC needs the powers to oversee and enforce new rules for demurrage and detention. Our current rules were supposed to lead to faster removal and return of containers. These days, the rules are frequently gamed by powerful players in the supply chain. Big shippers avoid the fees by signing contracts that give them priority to unload their containers first, a practice that further slows the overall processing of cargo. In the end, small shippers are left to wait and pay demurrage. In conclusion, our freight system was once the envy of the world, not just because we invested wisely in our infrastructure, but because we also valued our workers. I value our supply chain workers, the men and women of the ILWU who continue to put their lives on the line to ensure that our ports remain at being the best despite all the challenges. Thank you for inviting me to testify today, and I welcome any of your questions.
Thank you. We will now move on to Mr. Eugene D. Soroka.
Good morning, Chairman Carbajal, Ranking Members Graves and Gibbs, and other distinguished members of Congress. I'd also like to thank the subcommittee and Chairman DeFazio. I am Eugene D. Soroka, Executive Director at the Port of Los Angeles, with more than 33 years of experience in maritime shipping, logistics, both here in the United States and abroad. Thank you for inviting me to participate today. I appreciate the topic of today's hearing. When our supply chains work as they should, they operate unnoticed, delivering essential goods, creating jobs and economic prosperity across our nation. As America's busiest container port, the Port of Los Angeles has an outsized responsibility to move the country's cargo. While 1/3 of our cargo is consumed within the Southern California region, fully 2/3 goes to the national market, reaching every congressional district in the United States. Changes in consumer behavior, trading patterns, and manufacturing supply chains are reflected in our volume. A year ago, after nationwide stay-at-home orders went into effect, cargo volume here at the port dropped 20%. There was plenty of space available at our marine terminals, and we saw a large number of canceled vessel sailings. Now, a year later, we find ourselves 11 months into an unprecedented import surge, while export volume continues to languish. Import volume has taken off as consumers shifted from spending on services to goods. This was also fueled by stimulus dollars. As a result, the Port of Los Angeles has averaged more than 900,000 container units per month every month since last July. 900,000 used to be a strong month in our peak season. Just last week, we commemorated handling our 10 millionth container in fiscal year 21, a first for any port in the Western Hemisphere. And today, I will announce 1 million TEUs crossed our docks in the month of May. To give you a sense of scale, 10 million containers laid end to end would wrap around the world 1.5 times. By any measure, it's an amazing accomplishment for our terminal operators and longshore workers alike. Productivity at the port has never been higher. Before the pandemic, we averaged 10 container ships at berth per day. During this surge, we're handling 15 ships daily. Longshore women and men are filling 50,000 work shifts a week, well above our 3-year running average. Still, the massive influx of cargo we've seen has placed enormous strain on the entire system. Our tarmacs remain 95% utilized when 80% is considered full. As a result, truck turn times have increased. With terminals full, ships take longer to process, and incoming arrivals are directed straight to anchor. At its peak, we had 40 container vessels at anchor back in February, waiting an average of nearly 8 days. Today, through a lot of hard work and collaboration, we've reduced that backlog by 75%, with an average wait time of 5 days. Today at the port, we're working 15 ships, with 12 at anchor in the San Pedro Bay, 10 of those destined to Los Angeles. Despite nearly 2 billion square feet of warehouses in our region, those facilities filled up, and our importers have resorted to using containers as temporary storage. That equipment is not cycling back into the system fast enough. On terminal, boxes are averaging 4 days till pickup versus 2 pre-surge. Marine terminal utilization remains well above designed capacity. Containers waiting to be loaded on trains now sit for 9 days on average, when in normal times they would wait 2 days. All of this leads to increased complexity and shipping costs. The impacts to exporters who have been challenged on 3 fronts: our own trade policy, strength of the US dollar, and supply-demand issues pushing record numbers of empty containers back to Asia. In summary, there are just a few points I'd like to emphasize. First, while these supply chain issues are global, this is still a relationship-based business. We continue to work closely with the Agricultural Transportation Coalition, the California Secretary of Agriculture, and so many other industry stakeholders to drive solutions and improve. Second, robust investment in our freight system is needed, especially in the area of digitization. We have rolled out 4 such digital products in response to user needs, and I have advocated for a nationwide adoption of port community systems, which can help businesses and service providers improve their supply chains. Third, we need a national strategy to enhance competitiveness of our supply chains, including getting American products to export markets and supporting key industries here at home, like agriculture and manufacturing. With that, I'll conclude my comments. Thank you for joining today, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. We will conclude our panel presentation with Ms. Jen Sorensen.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Gibbs, Congressman Graves, Congressman DeFazio. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on an issue of critical importance to agriculture and to the U.S. pork industry. I'm the Communications Director for Iowa Select Farms in Iowa, and I'm President of the National Pork Producers Council, an association representing over 60,000 U.S. pork producers. Expansion of export markets is so critical to the continued success of our industry. As the world's top exporter, U.S. pork annually ships more than 7 billion to foreign destinations. The past few years have been incredibly difficult for U.S. hog farmers after more than 3 years of trade retaliation and limited pork producers' ability to compete effectively around the globe. COVID pandemic unleashed unprecedented challenges for all of us, for the entire food supply chain. Now, just as producers and production has returned to some sense of normalcy, shipping delays at our international ports are causing serious issues for U.S. pork producers and other agricultural exporters. If not addressed soon, these delays have the potential to cause significant backup at our processing plants and to our hog farms, once again placing producers in a difficult situation, not to mention the animal welfare implications caused by the backup of animals on our farms. On an annual basis, U.S. pork producers have historically exported more than 1/4 of production to over 100 countries. These countries include those in Latin America and the Asia Pacific region, and they have come to trust our affordable, safe, and reliable pork supply. And like other sectors of the U.S. economy, we rely on vessel operating common carriers to ship product overseas. Typically, shipping containers loaded with imported goods are unloaded, sent to rural areas, filled with U.S. pork and other agricultural commodities, and then shipped abroad. However, the COVID pandemic, as we know and have talked about, have increased these shipping issues as the United States imported higher amounts of consumer goods, causing a backlog at ports throughout the country. This backlog is due to numerous factors, including congestion in and around the terminals and limited hours of operation. West Coast ports, which serve the growing Asia Pacific market, are being significantly impacted by this backlog. Currently, there are over 1,000 containers of pork sitting at West Coast ports waiting to be exported. Compounding this situation, carriers are failing to provide accurate notice to exporters of arrival, departure, and cargo loading times, and then imposing financial penalties on exporters for missing these loading windows. These financial penalties, which are paid to the very carriers that are canceling the orders, have been deemed unreasonable by the Federal Maritime Commission. Ultimately, these additional costs are passed down the supply chain to farmers. Shipping delays are affecting all of U.S. agriculture, including pork. The Asia Pacific region is among our top market due to its cultural preference for pork. Thanks to recent trade agreements with China and Japan, spearheaded by NPPC, U.S. pork exports to those countries saw a significant uptick in 2020. In fact, in 2020, U.S. pork sent 52%, of all exports worth $3 billion through West Coast ports in Long Beach, LA, Oakland, California, as well as Seattle and Tacoma, Washington. These shipping delays to Asia Pacific region are increasing costs to U.S. pork and positioning the United States as an unreliable trading partner. If left unaddressed, this might also negatively impact future trade agreements with Southeast Asia trading partners. The Agriculture Transportation Coalition, of which NPPC is a member, has compiled 3 solutions. Number 1, expand hours for U.S. ports. Number 2, mandate that ocean carriers export cargo at safe capacity levels. And number 3, support and expedite the Federal Maritime Commission enforcement of a rule that declared the penalties being imposed on exporters as unreasonable. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you. We will now move on to member questions. Each member will be recognized for 5 minutes, and I will start by recognizing myself. Mr. Butler, I understand that at the marine terminals, the ocean carriers ultimately pay the wages of the longshoremen through port fees. If the terminal gates are operating longer hours, as sought by some carriers you represent, are they willing to pay for training and additional hours?
Mr. Chairman, the World Shipping Council is not the employer representative for those labor relations, so I would hesitate to talk about what people would be willing to pay. But I do know that there have been proposals made to extend hours, and that's something some of the other witnesses have addressed. It means everybody in the supply chain would have to be on board with the program.
Thank you. I've gotten reports of shipping companies reneging on contractual agreements with shippers in order to request more money or ship higher value cargo. Is that true from your understanding as well?
We've heard the same complaints. I don't have visibility into individual contracts, The only thing that I would say, Mr. Chairman, is when you hear a complaint like that, it's very important to get all of the facts because, and Commissioner Dye referred to this a little bit earlier, there is a bit of a problem with the entire contracting structure historically, in that there's a lack of commitment on both sides. Frankly, shippers, cargo owners don't want to commit large parts of their volume to a contract. Historically, they've done quite well playing the spot market. And so when somebody tells you that the contract has not been fulfilled, you need to ask the question, well, was your minimum specified quantity covered? And now we're talking about something beyond that. Essentially, are you in the spot market? So it's very critical to get all the facts. And I can't tell you about any given contract. I can tell you that ocean carriers are quite serious about fulfilling their end of the bargain with their service contracts. That's how they keep relationships with their customers.
Mr. Butler, from your understanding, what could we put in place to get to that information that you're talking about, the full set of facts?
Well, I think the only way you get the full set of facts in any particular situation is really through the complaint and or FMC initiated enforcement process. There are, as you know, millions and millions of containers, millions and millions of transactions, and thousands of service contracts floating around in this market. There's no way to have visibility into all of it at once. And I understand that's frustrating to people, but the fact of the matter is, if you're going to examine a commercial relationship and whether both sides are keeping up their end, you have to look at that particular relationship on a transactional basis. And the FMC is in a position to accept those complaints and also to initiate actions on its own. And incidentally on this, I categorically reject the idea that shippers are being threatened with retaliation for bringing complaints. I just don't buy that.
Thank you. In your written statement, you said that in reference to placing a priority on agriculture cargoes, quote, "It is not possible to favor one group of customers without disrupting the functioning of the entire system to the detriment of all." I agree with your statement, but isn't that exactly what's happening with the prioritization of Asian imports by shipping empty containers at the detriment of West Coast exporters?
Mr. Carbajal, the shipping industry takes the cargo that is presented to it. And as a number of the witnesses, including myself, have said today, what's really driving these problems at root is the massive increase in U.S. imports. And some people today have characterized that as essentially Asian exporters pushing product to the United States. But the fact of the matter is, from the shipping side, the majority of import cargo is contracted by U.S. importers. They are U.S. companies bringing these goods to the United States for U.S. consumers. On this issue of the trade imbalance, there's no question whatsoever that that exacerbates things. In normal times, it's 2-to-1 imports to exports into the U.S. Right now, we're basically at 3-to-1 imports to exports. And if you're going to keep the whole system moving, you do have to send empty containers back to those other origins. Otherwise, the whole thing stops.
Thank you, Mr. Butler.
Tough on everybody.
Ms. Sorensen, could you comment on that? Are carriers taking your products? You have no issue or challenge going on?
We are having challenges right now. And, the Agriculture Transportation Coalition's informal survey of ag commodities on average says 22% of ag export sales are not being performed due to capacity issues. This is about lost opportunities and an erosion of relationships. You look at Japan, and they have very disconcerting tastes. They want chilled pork. And when we have to freeze that pork down and deliver it frozen, we lose a tremendous amount of value to U.S. hog farmers. And not only value, we erode that relationship that we've built over time with Japan. So we're definitely losing opportunities, and we're losing collectively as agriculture 22% of our export sales.
Thank you very much. I'm run out of time, so now I'm going to go on to Ranking Member Gibbs.
Thank you, Chairman. I guess the first question would be to Mr. Butler, and then maybe also specifically to Mr. Soroka for the Port of Los Angeles. But my first question is, we know how much the containers volumes have increased even over 2019, but do we track? I suppose they do. What percentage of those containers are going back to Asia out of the Port of LA, then in general for Mr. Butler, are empty? Do we know that data?
Mr. Gibbs, I expect Mr. Soroka, being a little closer to the port, probably has a better idea on that. What I would repeat is something I mentioned a moment ago, and that is we have gone from an import to export ratio in normal times of 2 to 1 to about 3 to 1 today. So there's no question that in order to keep the entire system moving, we're absolutely sending back more empties, simply because that's what you have to do to ultimately keep the entire round trip balanced. But as to a particular number, I do not have that.
Mr. Soroka, do you have any idea what's going on at the Port of Los Angeles, empty containers leaving?
Yeah, I do have a pretty good idea, Congressman. On average, during the course of the last 12 months, we've seen empty repositioning be about 30 to 35% of our overall lift. Correspondingly, imports have increased by 50% from Asia to the United States, with the bulk of them coming from China. The difficulty here in normal times is that imports traditionally move to major metropolitan areas where most of us U.S. consumers are located. Exports emanate from rural America. So how we square that circle, how we can create round trip and what we call in the industry triangulated economics, are really the formula that has to be cracked here.
Okay, the reason I was asking this, I'm kind of pursuing, on our first panel, two of my colleagues are drafting a bill, and I have a little bit of heartburn because I have a concern that to pass legislation that mandates the shippers that you have to take cargo or you don't or whatever, that kind of goes against our fundamental principles. But obviously there's an issue here. So I'm trying to figure out a way how you either incentivize shippers through price to make this work without mandates, because I have a problem with that. And obviously we had questions on more transparency and data transparency and more information. I don't know if our systems logistically are set up enough to do that. We've got to improve that. And so that's where I was kind of going on this. So I guess back to Mr. Butler, carriers, obviously they make their money by making trips back and forth across the Pacific. What incentives or what things do you think that would help this issue without penalizing them too bad, especially with a possibility hanging over a cloud hanging over there, there could be legislation that might not be favorable to their operations?
Well, Congressman, first, I agree there are real problems when you start talking about mandating to carry this particular product or that particular product. You're pretty quickly, frankly, into rate regulation and price mandates, because none of this operates independently of the economics. I think some of the things that have been raised today operationally are probably where we need to go. Our shipper colleagues and others on the hearing have mentioned the need for better information and more timely information. And I think that is something that both ocean carriers and others in the supply chain can do better. Because when you tell somebody to be at a certain place at a certain time to put their cargo on the ship, and then you can't handle it for whatever reason, that causes a real problem. So I think we should be looking at those operational issues and encouraging everyone to have better communication, frankly. A lot of it comes down to that.
Back, Mr. Soroka, I did want to ask the question about hours of operation at your port. What are the hours of operation?
We run traditionally 9 shifts of work per week at the Port of Los Angeles, Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, Monday through Thursday evening, 6 p.m. to 3 a.m. During this surge and even predating COVID-19, many of our terminal operators ran Saturday and Sunday gates, additional nighttime gates in an attempt to keep up with volume. That work is necessary not only based on sheer volume, but also to connect the other nodes of the supply chain. As was stated earlier, truckers have federally mandated hours of service. Warehouses are open for certain hours during the course of time, and our Western railroads run 24/7. So syncing all of those up are very important. But also today, Congressman, 30% of our truck appointments go unused on our night side shifts. It's our job collectively as industry to squeeze every hour of productivity that we can offer to our customers.
I got to conclude here, I'm out of time, but I would think on the I understand the intermodal questions and trucking and rail and all that, but when it's unloading and loading container ships, vessels, I would think that would be a 24/7 operation, but I guess it's not at LA. Is that what you're saying?
It's not, because there's only so much space. And as I mentioned in my comments, we're full, well over capacity still to this day. When the next ship comes in, sir, there's no room to put the cargo. We've implored and in some cases encouraged our importers to get the cargo out of the port and push it through the supply chain.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you. We will now move on to Representative Auchincloss and the Vice Chair of the subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the time and expertise our witnesses have provided. As we debate in Congress the big, ambitious infrastructure investments that we can make to create a more prosperous, a more inclusive, and more productive economy going forward, I wanted to ask a couple of questions about maritime infrastructure to our assembled experts here. I know that volume growth has especially impacted our West Coast ports, and we are seeing them really kind of bulging at the seams. I represent Massachusetts, and in my research for this hearing, talked to a number of experts who have pointed out that while, of course, the water route from Asia Pacific to the East Coast is longer, it can be more economical to ship goods to the East Coast ports if it shortens the overland routes. And up to 2/3 of the American consumer market can be reached quicker overland from East Coast ports than from West Coast ports, for example. So while the total over water shipping may be longer, the total shipping costs might be substantially lower if you're able to dock at East Coast ports. This is especially, I think, salient now that the Panama Canal has been widened for the bigger container ships. So I'd like to start with Mr. Butler, but anybody can weigh in here in helping me think about, for East Coast port infrastructure, what are some improvements that would make these ports better able to handle incoming cargo? And I'll list out a few that we've explored: on-dock rail transfer, inland ports to take away some of the pressure at the actual gate, interchanges or exits and roads that improve egress and ingress, additional container terminal automation, new terminals. I think Charleston was the first new one in 12 years that we've had on the East Coast, and then dredging as well to accommodate larger container vessels. And I'm sure there are others that I'm missing here, but would love to hear your thoughts and others on this panel about what infrastructure improvements East Coast ports could do to attract more cargo.
Congressman, it's a great question because it puts the emphasis where it really needs to be, which is on the whole system. Frankly, the 5 or 6 ideas that you've listed would probably be the top of my list as well. So I'm not sure I can improve much on that. But just to, if you will, reinforce your thinking, and Mr. Soroka knows this perhaps painfully, there has been, with the widening of the Panama Canal, a shifting of some cargo that would ordinarily come over the West Coast to East Coast ports. And so we have seen that happen, and we have seen East Coast ports, frankly, expand and respond to that demand. So I think this is something that you'll see more of. And I think having multiple gateways with that kind of capacity can only help when we see surges in the future, because we will.
Mr. Sirocco, I want to give you a chance to weigh in as well.
Yeah, Congressman, a great outline that you just gave, and Mr. Butler's response as well. But I'll have you know that in the last 10 years, the federal government has outinvested the West Coast ports by a number of 10 to 1. Nearly 11 billion US dollars invested in East and Gulf Coast ports versus a little more than $1 billion on the West Coast. An applied approach as we talk about infrastructure that has a better balanced investment across these gateways would be my recommendation. But your other outlines are very important. The densification of rail, the ability to move from ship to that rail to the inland point destination is important as well. And the overall look at cost is something that we in the industry take full view of on a regular basis. And while transits to the East Coast of the United States may be some 10 to 14 days longer, if there are bottlenecks in the supply chain, it gums up the whole works. So to have our ports fluid is extremely important, no matter what the coast. So it gives the cargo owners choice of gateways in the United States.
I appreciate that. And Mr. Chair, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. We will now move on to Representative Johnson.
Mr. Chairman?
Oh, sorry, Mr. De Leon, did you have something before my time began?
Mr. Chairman Carball, if I may respond to the last speaker's questions regarding a couple of things that he mentioned.
We usually don't do this, but we'll make an exception, Mr. Pons.
Well, thank you. I mean, we're talking about the movement of cargo to the West Coast and the inland transit to the East Coast. You know, typically you're looking at 22 days transit through the canal all the way to the East Coast. If you're coming to Los Angeles, it's a 14-day transit on water and 4 days into Chicago, another 3 days into the East Coast ports. And it's typically a more viable solution, and it's a cheaper solution. However, with the problems in the rails and the availabilities of rails and the railroad taking the advantage on increasing their prices because of the pandemic and because of this stuff, it's created a problem where individuals are looking for other sources and not just a ship to the West Coast. There's a whole lot of ships coming to the West Coast because it's quicker, and it's always been quicker with inland transit, and that's a fact. Whether it's in Los Angeles, San Francisco, or Seattle, Tacoma. The other part about automation that you bring up is that automation is a vehicle for to improve capacity is a farce, and we've seen it it doesn't improve a capacity. All it does is a cost-saving measure to reduce labor, and that's
Thank you,
fact.
Ms.
If you want to see that, you can come on down to a port of LA Long Beach, and we'll show you on the moves per hour at some of the ports.
Thank you, Mr. Ponce de Leon.
Thank you, but I
Thank
needed
you.
to say that.
Thank you. We will now move on to Representative Johnson, who was so gracious to wait.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll start with Ms. Sorensen. I thought you did a good job, ma'am, of outlining for some of us some of the impacts economically to pork producers in the broader pork industry. You mentioned specifically us being viewed as an unreliable trade partner, and then specifically to Southeastern, businesses and consumers that may be purchasing American pork. If they view us as unreliable, they may go find other sources for their pork. Do you have any sense of how ripe those two issues are? I mean, on a scale from 1 to 10, 10 being the damage is currently being done, contracts being canceled, and 1 being people are only beginning to get a sense of concern. How ripe do you think those concerns are?
Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't say 10, but last year exports added almost $60 to the average price producers received for every U.S. hog marketed, and two problems arise when we're only able to sell frozen and not fresh pork, which is what Japan loves. And Japan loves our loins, and it is really hard to find a buyer for pork loins, if you can believe it. But they love them, and they love them chilled. And so farmers would get less value for the hog if our market in Japan started to erode. This is, especially difficult after struggling with, over the few years with tariffs and non-tariff barriers to many of our important markets, and so that's affected the price of our product. And then
Sorensen, how much of a discount? I mean, just give us a ballpark. And obviously, production ag is an incredibly tight margin business, and even in good times, that can be the case. When you go from chilled to frozen, what kind of a discount does that impose?
I can't speak to the specific higher premium that, that's private information between the companies and the exporters. But if we can't deliver the product, we lose the market. And, when we pulled out a TPP and didn't have access to an FTA in Japan, we saw a major retailer switch from buying US pork to buying Canadian pork. And our foreign markets are extremely competitive with Brazil and Canada and the European Union. United States needs to stay competitive in the global pork market.
Okay, and then Mr. Soroka, shifting to you, because Ms. Sorensen mentioned in her testimony, expanding, extra gate hours, and then Mr. Ponce de Leon mentioned a willingness, at least on behalf of labor, for the extra gate hours. You seem to indicate that physical space was the real choke point, the real limiting factor. I mean, is that the case? There is nothing that additional work hours, extra gate hours could do to physically clear the space at the ports?
Sir, there are a number of causals to what we see today. Physical space being one, the lack of velocity of containers moving in and out of the port is second. The ability to match up all the nodes of the supply chain. As I mentioned, drivers of trucks have specific hours of operations that are federally mandated. They need to match up with the port's operations as we do with the warehouse operations. So it's all folks working together to get on a calendar that would make sense for additional hours of operation at the one node being the port. And that's something that we continue to explore and work with other folks. I'm sorry, sir.
It seems like when I talk to others involved with the other parts of the intermodal universe, they really view the ports as the choke point. I think your point about getting everybody synced up is good, but I mean, at some point you've got truck drivers and you've got railroads who are kind of they're not delivering product more quickly than you can handle it. They're delivering it only as quickly as you can handle it. So if you all are the limiting factor, is there anything that can be done to expand gate hours?
Yes, and number one, I would defer to Mr. Ponce de Leon. There is specific language in the collective bargaining agreement between the employers and the dock workers that speak to how we can do that right now. Second, the port's growth, and I mentioned earlier on in my comments that our vessel productivity in large part due to longshore labor is up 50% during this pandemic. We're welcoming 50% more vessels in port every day. We've eclipsed 10 million container units and 1 million for the month. Never before has that been done at a Western Hemisphere port. But we all have to have this inertia to improve in all areas. And as has been highlighted here today, information technology will allow us to shine a light with greater transparency. Think of it as a heat map. Where are the bottlenecks? Where can we attack them quickly? What's coming at us so we can prepare our assets and our staffing, and flip to the other side where the buyer of these services, the cargo owners, importers, and exporters can make choices to clear the paths in their supply chains.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I see my time has expired.
Thank you. Not seeing any more questions I need to ask. Is there any more questions by the subcommittee?
Well, Mr. Chairman, if it's not too much of an imposition, could I ask a follow-up?
By all means.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think all your comments are well said, sir. And I realize, I mean, and I know you guys know this. It's not like you need Congress to tell any of you about the strain. but the strain is very real. And I don't know whether it's a 10 like Ms. Sorensen said or not, but it's a high number regardless of what it is. And I know that the systems are running generally well, and that they're handling volumes that have never before been seen in the Western Hemisphere. I don't doubt any of that. But I do think it's going to take an extraordinary effort, something far beyond normal, to be able to chew through some of these bottlenecks. And I think if we want America to remain competitive, and if we want to be able to meet the demands of the world for this unbelievably high quality American food, we are really going to need everybody, labor and ports and shippers and carriers and everybody to get this done. And so I would just, and Mr. Soroka, I'd of course give you an opportunity to respond, but I would just say, if there is any barrier that Congress can remove to allow all of you to enact that extraordinary effort, please know that we stand ready to listen to your pleas and respond, because business as usual is simply not going to get this done. What am I missing, sir?
No, we understand and we're in lockstep with you, Congressman. Again, I'll put it into three major categories. The investment in this port and infrastructure system, as was stated earlier, is both of the physical and the digital. We need deeper involvement in our road and street connectors, also densification of rail. The technology is such now that we can not only get to our major cities via rail from the West Coast of the United States, but we need to get to the secondary and tertiary cities with that on-dock rail capability. The second is what you said, and what we call it in the industry is supply chain optimization. Looking at all these opportunities from labor to the employer, hours of operation, and how we mesh in with the truckers, the rail providers, and others. We're doing that on the ground every day. There was a time pre-recession days where we were stuck at 8 million container units a year. Now we're piercing through 10 to 11, and we'll continue to find those ways to continuously improve. And the third piece is what I've called for, a national export policy, not regulation, not biting people down, but finding a way to get the 8-9 million folks back on the job, creating incentives, whether they be on the tax structure, the ability to access markets, or other means that the federal government holds to get our exporters in contact with their customers. And what Jen is talking about lastly is extremely important, but it's a very specialized service of refrigerated containers, either chilled or frozen, that we can carve out as an industry and put an extra spotlight on to assist her constituents and members outside of the normal path of a dry container. And lastly, it's all about round-trip economics, sir. At the end of this torrid surge in American consumer buying, we will level off as we start flying again, going to see our grandparents, going to ball games and movies. And the industry will need the American exporter. So your timing is perfect to gear up that conversation so we can pre-plan and pre-position our wares to make sure that the American exporter can rise up again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the extra time.
Thank you. Next, I'll recognize myself. Mr. Soroka, if Congress were to make a significant investment in port infrastructure, like that proposed in the American Jobs Plan, how would that funding be used, and how would that help alleviate situations like this in the future?
Oh, there's a lot to like about the American Jobs Plan. With more than $621 billion proposed for transportation, I would say the $17 billion proposed for ports and waterways could be increased a little bit. I talked not only about Los Angeles, which has the wherewithal and resources to make most of its investment, but to really double down on how we can improve our competitiveness on the global stage. It's what I just mentioned. It's about the physical infrastructure, the rail on dock, the rail connectors, the roadways, to be able to move cargo out more seamlessly and quicker. Again, with 7,500 acres of property and 43 miles of waterway, I commend the United States Congress for passing the Water Resources Development Act of 2020 back in December, which recapitulated the thought of the Harbor Maintenance Trust in allowing for donor equity, expanded uses, while not taking any money away from smaller ports and harbors. That, we believe, should be the kickstart to a broader infrastructure play. In addition to that, the digital infrastructure that we continue to talk about has been proven here at the Port of Los Angeles. We need a nationwide system that allows for visibility, transparency, and more importantly, in situations like this, what we call exception management. How can we move vessels around quicker? How can we get cargo moved in and out? And when we have an issue like we do today in Los Angeles, with 30% of our truck appointments going unused, we can shine a light on that immediately, move cargo to where those additional capacities lie, and move the cargo more fluidly. In addition, there are carve-outs for electrification, broadband throughout the United States, as well as grid resiliency. All of those can be used quite well here, even with small carve-outs at the nation's largest port.
Thank you very much. To conclude our questions, Ms. Sorensen, in your testimony, you recommend a mandate to require ocean carriers to carry your cargo. Practically, how would that work? Who would determine that rate from your perspective?
I believe the Ag Transportation Coalition can provide a little bit more detail, but it is my understanding that the carriers are going back under that 70 to 75% capacity level, which has been deemed as safe. So that was my comment around, when the carriers go back filled with ag exports, fill them to what has been deemed as the safe capacity level of 70 to 75%.
Thank you very much. I'm going to work on that issue with Ranking Member Gibbs. I think he has some innovative concepts that we can explore. So I look forward to working with Representative Gibbs on that issue. Thank you. In closing, that concludes our hearing for today. I want to thank all the witnesses for your testimony. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record for today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered, the subcommittee stands adjourned.